Welcome to Whispers and Confessions. There might be a twist waiting, so please make sure to watch until the end. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Let's begin right away.
My husband's perverse desires drew me into the nightmarish game of wife swapping. At first, I thought it was just my husband's curiosity seeking new stimulation, but I never imagined it would lead to the destruction of our marriage. My husband tried to convince me that wife swapping was just another adventure. However, that adventure plunged me into deep confusion and a sense of loss, and I found myself struggling to escape this nightmare. Hello. To protect our family, I will use pseudonyms for all names. I was 35 years old, and my husband was 2 years older than me. We had been married for 10 years, having started dating in college and eventually getting married. However, after 2 years of marriage without conceiving a child, we underwent thorough medical examinations and received shocking results. The fact was that we couldn't have children due to my husband's azoospermia. Originally, I had wanted to have 2 or 3 children, so after learning this fact, I suffered from depression for a while. Although my husband hadn't done anything wrong, seeing him suffer alongside me, I eventually decided to accept this reality. But there was still a lingering sense of regret in a corner of my heart. Nevertheless, if my husband hadn't made one mistake, I would have tried to maintain our married life as it was. But everything started to change because of the incident of wife swapping. I'm not such a conservative person. However, as a civil servant, I usually dress conservatively. In such an environment, it's necessary to avoid standing out too much. In the past, it was common to exchange jokes in the office, even in public institutions. But after the Me Too movement, everyone became more cautious. Men, in particular, seemed to act more carefully. I think the atmosphere was better before. But friends in their 20s say they don't like such jokes. Anyway, even though I'm a woman, I don't really like the current atmosphere. I wanted to escape from this environment. My husband has a slightly different personality from mine. He is open-minded and easily accepts new things. Perhaps it's because of his personality. Everything started from him. In a house without children, there are very limited things a couple can do. I don't know well because we don't raise children, but it seems certain that children bring vitality to a home. That's why I envy families with children very much. Our couple tried many things we could enjoy together. What I'm talking about is the intimate relationship between husband and wife. We've tried it everywhere people can imagine, in the car, outdoors, even in a tent at a busy campsite, in the stairwell of our apartment building. We even once deliberately chose an unpopular movie and did it in a cinema where only we were present. But as 10 years passed, our couple's relationship gradually lost interest. In fact, these attempts were mostly initiated by my husband, and I tended to follow his desires. However, now even my husband seemed to find it difficult to find something stimulating, and for a while, such attempts quieted down. After that, our couple only had relations 2 or 3 times a month, and my husband seemed to be losing interest more and more. Perhaps many couples experience the same problem as us as their married life gets longer, but there seems to be no panacea to solve it. Most people accept the ordinary and live their whole lives that way. But some people are not satisfied with the ordinary. My husband was such a person. I was more or less satisfied with our current life and didn't have major complaints, but my husband thought differently. He always said that to enrich married life, new stimulation is needed. I jokingly asked him, "Aren't you afraid I might run away?" But my husband's answer was always confident. Life is short. You should enjoy it fully too. Life is only once. You should experience many things while you're young and beautiful, so you won't regret it later. He always pleased me by saying such things. However, I never expected that such words would eventually bring a big change to our relationship. In fact, at that time, I never thought this would become a trap. From some point on, my husband started making strange suggestions continuously, and at first, I inwardly laughed, thinking, "What is this person thinking?" However, while vaguely feeling that this was wrong from the start, I became curious due to my husband's persistent persuasion and passed over it without deep argument. This eventually meant that I tacitly approved of my husband's proposal, and it seems that the ordinariness of our long married life really made me feel bored. For a few weeks after that, my husband started looking for related information on the internet. At first, it was just browsing adult movies or forums, but as time passed, my husband began to show me movies about wife swapping. It was a Japanese wife swapping movie, and I was greatly shocked at first. Watching the provocative scenes in the movie, I found it hard to believe how two couples could act so casually in one space. At the time, I thought it was just a movie setting because there are many provocative movies in Japan. But after that, my husband occasionally started talking to me about the idea of wife swapping. I took this as a simple joke and didn't pay much attention. However, my husband secretly started accessing wife swapping forums and actually interacting with such people. The content and photos being discussed on that forum shocked me greatly, and I learned that such things were really happening in New York State too. The sight of couples swapping their spouses and having relationships completely shook my worldview. My husband, observing my reaction, suggested we actually try wife swapping. At that time, I clearly said I didn't want to, but I didn't firmly refuse. Looking back now, I can't understand why I responded so ambiguously then. If I had firmly refused at that time, the situation wouldn't have developed as it has today. When I didn't clearly refuse, my husband took it as an indefinite thing and started looking for exchange partners more actively. One day after the Lunar New Year, my husband suddenly dragged me in front of the computer and showed me the contents of a Facebook conversation. The content was that a man from Chicago wanted to contact us. I was very angry at that time. I couldn't believe my husband was really doing this. My husband immediately tried to calm me down, promising that it was just to make contact once, and if I didn't agree, he would cut off contact right away. That man was Michael, the owner of an Italian restaurant in Chicago, and he was 2 years younger than my husband. Although it was difficult to accept this situation, amid my husband's persistent persuasion and my inner confusion, I eventually agreed to my husband's proposal, not knowing at all what impact this would have on our married life. Our couple immediately started exchanging contacts with Michael through video calls. In the video, the other party was large in build and not particularly handsome in appearance, but he had some charm, so at least I didn't dislike him. At first, only the two men appeared in the video, which was to allow each other's wives to check the other party. Michael asked my husband to show his wife, and my husband looked at me and gave me a sign. I was a bit embarrassed, but eventually nodded and revealed myself on the screen. That night, my husband whispered in my ear, "You're going to have sex with a stranger now. Aren't you excited?" and embraced me passionately. Surprisingly, I started to get excited by those words too. That night we made deep love for the first time in a long while, and in that afterglow, we promised our first meeting. I felt uncomfortable doing this at our home, so we decided to meet in Chicago. On the weekend, our couple drove to Chicago. When we arrived at the underground parking lot of an apartment building at the address Michael had left, Michael came out to greet us. He was a very large man, standing at 190 centimeters tall. Even my husband, who is 180 centimeters, looked small in front of him. Michael had an expression as if he had been waiting for us for a long time, and my husband and I looked at each other and burst into laughter to relieve the tension. Michael was a person with a very gentle and friendly personality. He naturally led the conversation by explaining a few situations to us, and soon we started to feel a sense of intimacy with each other. However, as it was my first time doing such an activity, I was still nervous. I felt my smile freezing on my face. As we got into the elevator, Michael saw my expression and said with a smile, "Matilda, is it your first time? No need to be nervous. You can stop anytime. Or we can just have a conversation, the four of us." At his words, my face turned red instantly, and I lowered my head in embarrassment. Not long after, we arrived at our destination. They lived on the 25th floor, the top floor of the apartment, and through the large windows in the spacious living room of over 40 pyeong, we could look down on the entire city. The view was truly beautiful. Michael's wife had already prepared the meal and welcomed us. We all sat at the table, ate together, and chatted, gradually easing the tension between us. "The food is really delicious. Did you cook it yourself?" my husband asked Michael's wife. She smiled and replied, "Yes, I enjoy cooking, so I often prepare meals at home." "I'm glad you're enjoying it. You seem to be very skilled." "I'd like to learn from you," I chimed in. "Come over anytime. Let's cook together," Michael's wife said kindly with a smile. We quickly finished our meal and then spent some time getting to know each other in a more relaxed atmosphere. It felt as if we were slowly preparing each other for this moment. Michael's wife was 31 years old, younger than me, but honestly, her appearance seemed slightly lacking compared to mine. I'm confident in my looks. At 172 centimeters tall, weighing 55 kilograms, with a slightly voluptuous figure and 80C breasts, I'm often considered quite sexy. Michael's wife was 160 centimeters tall with a slightly thin build. However, what stood out was that she looked young enough to pass for her mid-20s, and her skin was very fair and clear. She had her own innocent charm and, as a yoga instructor, boasted a toned body. In that sense, I could understand why my husband was interested in her. To be honest, I felt a bit jealous. After finishing our meal with our minds floating, we sat in the living room and watched TV for a while. The atmosphere was a bit awkward, but Michael broke the silence. He suggested to us, "We have a beam projector in our bedroom where we can watch movies. Shall we watch one?" My husband looked at me once, and I lowered my head without saying anything. He nodded, and we decided to follow Michael's suggestion. The Michael couple led us to their bedroom. Michael's wife naturally sat on the bed, and my husband also sat comfortably on the other side of the bed. I carefully sat on the window bench sofa. Michael lowered the screen on the wall opposite the bed and turned on the beam projector to play an adult film. This scene was similar to those that often appear in various exchange stories. He seemed to have a lot of experience with this already. After a while, Michael came and sat next to me. I was flustered, not knowing what to do. My husband was smiling, watching us with seeming indifference. When I showed no reaction, Michael wrapped his arm around my waist. As his large hand encircled my waist, I strangely felt my body relax a bit. Michael whispered in my ear, "Matilda, I've liked you since I first saw you." My face immediately flushed. As Michael applied more pressure, I found myself leaning against him. My husband, seeing this, lay down on the bed and moved closer to Michael's wife. Michael's wife didn't resist and allowed my husband to embrace her. A moment later, Michael suggested, "Let's go take a shower now." My husband agreed and went into the bathroom with Michael's wife. As they left, I felt as if I had been left alone, and I sighed inwardly. In this situation, numerous thoughts crossed my mind. Was this really what I wanted? Or had I been inevitably swept along by my husband's desires? Deep in my heart, confusion was rising, but in the situation that had already begun, I felt I had no choice but to move forward. As soon as Michael confirmed that my husband had left the room, he reached out and pulled me into his arms. I let out a small gasp of surprise. Perhaps he took that sound as my consent, because he immediately covered my lips with his and began to kiss me deeply. To be honest, he was a man with excellent kissing skills. I was surprisingly comfortable with his kiss, and as our tongues intertwined, I felt an electric sensation. Seeing my response, Michael began to explore my body more actively. As his hands started to knead my voluptuous areas over my clothes, my body gradually relaxed, and he began to slowly undress me. Because it was winter and I was wearing a sweater, it wasn't easy to take off my clothes. He gently said to me, "Matilda, please take off your clothes." As if under a spell, I began to do as he said. I slowly stood up and started to take off my clothes one by one, and he was watching the process intently. At first, I was a bit embarrassed, but as each piece of clothing came off, I became even more embarrassed. It was the first time since dating my husband that I was undressing in front of another man. Finally, standing there with only my underwear on, he pulled me close and made me kneel. Once again obeying his words, I knelt down and started to undress him. Michael's body was truly muscular and looked very healthy. Especially his abdominal muscles were very attractive. I looked at his body with surprised eyes. Michael smiled and showed off his body as if boasting, and I couldn't help but laugh at his display. At that moment, The atmosphere became much more comfortable. I realized that whatever my choice was in this situation, I had to move forward. At that moment, my husband and Michael's wife came out after finishing their shower. My face reddened again. Michael lifted me up and said to my husband, "Matilda is really beautiful and charming." My husband gave a slightly awkward smile. Seeing that, I realized why my husband had looked so anxious. Perhaps he was very nervous because it was his first exchange. Michael pulled me into the bathroom, where warm water was still running. He untied my hair tie, letting my long, straight hair fall. We kissed passionately again. This time, I reciprocated actively. My body was already very sensitive and craving a man. Thoughts of what my husband might look like with another woman crossed my mind. Suddenly, I felt jealous. Perhaps because my husband had been completely focused on her just moments ago. I completely broke down. This night was an endless hot night. What I had never imagined before finally happened. We continued from 8 p.m. until morning, and I fell asleep in my husband's arms, completely exhausted. Fortunately, my husband didn't give up his right to the final moment. I slept until 3 p.m. on Sunday. When I woke up, they were already dressed and chatting in the living room. Michael's wife was said to be very open-minded. Michael didn't say much, occasionally glancing at me from the side, and his gaze made me shudder. I shivered as I recalled the lewd experiences of last night. My husband looked a bit drained. The reason was clear without needing to be said. We ordered lunch for delivery, and after finishing, my husband said we should leave. The Michael couple didn't stop us, just saying a few perfunctory words. Michael saw us off to the underground parking lot. We started the car, said goodbye to him, and left. On the way home, I barely spoke to my husband. After returning home, I hugged my husband tightly, afraid of losing something. After this experience, our life returned to normal. However, my husband was no longer obsessed with swapping, but he suddenly became very rough in bed. He often acted very aggressively. I could tell he was stimulated by that experience. He would often ask during intimacy, "How was that day? Was Michael better than me?" Since he's tall, that part must have been big too. I knew his pride was hurt, and I comforted him a lot. My husband was more passionate than before. I could never feel that trembling sensation from that night again. Time flew by quickly, and I thought everything was over. But this was just the beginning. It was 3 months later. My husband had to leave home for a month on a business trip. About 10 days after my husband left, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from Michael. Sometimes I think that a person's life seems to be controlled by fate. Michael called and said, "Matilda, it's been a while. How have you been? When can we meet again?" I replied, "I can't come because my husband is on a business trip." Michael said, "Can't you come without your husband? Can't we have fun on our own? Aren't you lonely? Come to Chicago and show your face. I'll wait for you on the weekend." It seemed as if he was hinting at something that struck my heart. For a moment, I was at a loss for words, my heart pounding, and I couldn't refuse anymore. Michael continued, "You haven't forgotten me either, right? Why are you deceiving yourself? Let's spend a wonderful night together. You'll be satisfied too." His words sounded like magic. From that moment, I realized he had a power over me that I couldn't resist. I said, "I'll think about it," and hung up the phone, falling into endless agony. I knew now that this wasn't just a simple, emotionless exchange. I felt like I was standing on the edge of danger and felt afraid. At 35, I was already past my youth, with a stable job and a happy family. But I was helplessly being drawn into a fatal temptation. Was it his attractive appearance or enormous size that confused me? Or was it his strong presence? After hanging up, I unconsciously called my husband. My husband's familiar voice came through. "Honey, it's me." I suddenly lost my words. "Oh, honey, why did you call?" "I was just wondering when you're coming back." My husband asked curiously, "Why? Is something wrong?" "No, I just watched a movie last night and missed you." I knew this was the best effort I could make. But I don't know why I didn't tell my husband about Michael asking to meet separately. My husband replied, "It's still going to take some more time. It'll take at least until the end of the month." His voice was still light. Can't you come back a little earlier? I miss you. I hesitated for a moment and mustered up great courage to say those words. But at that moment, the fact that I wasn't telling my husband about the appointment with Michael made me even more confused. My husband quietly asked, "It seems like you have something on your mind. What's wrong?" I was fiercely battling within myself whether to tell him or not. "I just feel a bit off these days. I guess it's because you're not here," my husband said in a worried voice. "Then I'll try to find a way to return early. Just hang in there a little longer." Those words made me feel relieved, but at the same time, my anxiety about meeting Michael grew even more. My husband then said, "Let's talk again in the evening. I need to go into the office now," and hung up. I felt a bit disappointed hearing the disconnection on the other end. At that moment, I had originally intended to tell my husband about Michael, but the regret of not being able to tell him grew bigger and bigger. That evening, I waited for my husband's call. I considered this a test of fate. If my husband called, I decided to tell him about Michael and refuse to meet him. But if the call didn't come, I didn't know what to do. In the end, my husband's call didn't come that night, and I spent a long, sleepless night. Is this also a trick of fate? Sometimes I believe in destiny. 2 more days passed, and on Friday, Michael called again. "When can you come?" I was silent for a moment, and he was waiting for my answer. I imagined Michael smiling confidently on the other end of the phone. My stubborn personality exploded. "I'm not going." A disappointed voice was heard from the other end. He didn't try to seduce me anymore, and I hung up the phone. I let out a sigh of relief, but at the same time, I felt an inexplicable emotion. I felt fortunate that this was the last resistance I could muster. The next day, Saturday, I was shopping alone, thinking this matter was over. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was Michael. "I'm in New York for business." "Where are you, Matilda?" My heart started pounding. "I'm out shopping right now." "Has your husband returned?" "No, he's still on a business trip." "Then come now." "I miss you so much, Matilda." "I'm at Hotel XX, room 5. Come quickly. I'll be waiting." His voice was firm. I tried to say something more, but he had already hung up. I was momentarily confused. I didn't know what to do, and my heart was in constant conflict. I asked myself over and over whether to follow Michael's words or to stop even now. But in the end, I was led by my instincts towards that hotel. All sorts of thoughts crossed my mind, and my steps became heavier. When I arrived at the hotel, I paused for a moment in the lobby. The thought, should I turn back here, crossed my mind, but I eventually got on the elevator. Arriving on the 5th floor, I stood in front of room 5 that Michael had mentioned. Just as I was about to knock, I hesitated once again. But I felt that there was no turning back now that I had come this far. I carefully knocked on the door, and soon it opened, revealing Michael's face. As soon as he saw me, he smiled and said, "It's been a while, Matilda. Come in." His voice was warm but at the same time strongly pulled me in. I followed his words and went inside. As the door closed, I was enveloped in an inexplicable fear and excitement. Michael sat me on the sofa and poured me a cup of tea. "How have you been?" he asked in a calm voice. I sipped the tea and answered his question simply. "I've been living ordinarily." He looked at my face and said, "Matilda, I've been thinking about you constantly. You haven't forgotten that feeling from back then either, have you?" At his words, my heart started racing, and the reality of meeting him again became clearer. But at that moment, my husband's face flashed in my mind. The question, "Is this really the right thing to do?" filled my head. I looked away from Michael and was lost in thought for a moment. Seeing my hesitation, Michael approached and took my hand. "Matilda, this is our secret just between the two of us. No one else needs to know, only we need to know. So don't worry." His words were sweet and succeeded in persuading me. I met his eyes and quietly nodded. That night, I spent time with Michael. But in a corner of my heart, anxiety and guilt still remained. As the night deepened, I was confused whether the situation was reality or if I was in a dream. But I felt a sense of relief, as if a rock that had been pressing down on my heart for days had been lifted. At least, I thought this was a kind of liberation. During our break, we talked for a long time. While discussing the exchange process, Michael said with a serious expression, "Do you know why you didn't refuse at first? It's because subconsciously, you were tired of your ordinary life." I hastily replied, "No, that's not true. I can be content with an ordinary life." However, Michael shook his head and continued, "That's just you being stubborn. But have you thought about why you have such an unconscious desire? It's because you're inherently a woman with desires. You need the pleasure that a man like this can give you. The unconscious is something you can't know yourself, right? If it wasn't, would it really be unconscious?" His words seemed to be persuading me that I should accept those desires. Then he added, "This is precisely your destiny's plan." His words confused me. I was asking myself, is this really my destiny's plan? Michael embraced me tightly and whispered softly, "You are not only the sexiest woman to me, but also the woman destined for me. I'll let you enjoy your body with the hottest passion." His soft voice and breath made me melt completely. Deep in my heart, I started to think, yes, this is my destiny. That night, we indulged in each other's bodies for 8 hours, barely leaving the bed. We grew fond of each other, and, even while sleeping, I found myself touching his body. Having escaped from the stifling life of the past 30 years, I felt a great sense of fulfillment in this new lifestyle. Michael's broad and firm chest gave me a sense of security, and I felt it was what I needed most. I wanted to escape from my meaningless daily routine and live a fulfilling life. Until my husband returned, Michael would come near our house every weekend to call for me. Even on weekdays, he would drive to meet me. As a restaurant owner, he had more free time than I did. Sometimes after work, sometimes after dinner, and even during lunch breaks, I would leave my workplace to meet him. We had relations in his car or even in deserted parks. I craved meetings with Michael as if I were mad. His presence was a symbol of intense passion for me, and I was completely captivated by that passion. The night before my husband was to return, I didn't go home. In our encounter that lasted until dawn, he led me to climax once again. At that moment, I desperately asked him, "Do you love me?" But Michael only smiled instead of answering. It was the smile of a victor. To meet me more comfortably, Michael rented a small studio apartment a little distance from our house. It was a place prepared solely for our secret meetings, and I was ready to go meet him anytime. Whenever Michael came to New York, I would disappear for hours and head to the house he had rented. Michael especially liked me waiting for him in the bathroom, wearing sexy lingerie and showering. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of myself in the mirror, the white tight underwear clinging to my body wet from the shower, the faintly visible curves, and wet hair sticking to my body. At those moments, my body was voluptuous and transparent, and my expression was seductive. Michael acted as if he owned every part of me, showcasing various techniques and enjoying me in multiple ways. I was so captivated by his charm that I accepted everything. His passion was so intense it seemed like it would devour me, and his techniques were sometimes very lewd. But he seduced me and made me fascinated by his skills. His persuasiveness, which didn't even allow me to think of resisting, was truly powerful. He often blindfolded me, tied me to the bed, and insulted me with obscene language. He even used clips on my body, but completely enthralled by his charm, I endured everything. He made me into a being that could do anything to please him. One day, I received another call from Michael. He said he would come to New York on Thursday and told me to prepare for a new game. Even after half a year, my heart still fluttered every time I received his call. On Thursday afternoon, I took a half day off from work and headed to the house he had rented. Michael was already waiting for me there. We hardly exchanged any words when we met and went straight to the point. As soon as I opened the door, we kissed passionately, and his passion was as unchanging as ever. After the kiss ended, he smiled at me, and I knew what was coming next. So I voluntarily started to undress. By now, I knew well how to undress to please him. I slowly took off my outer clothes, unbuttoned my shirt one by one, and lowered my skirt slowly. He sat on the bed, eyes narrowed, enjoying my performance. I was wearing a black garter belt, semi-transparent underwear, and black stockings. This was his favorite outfit. After undressing completely, I would undress him. He knew exactly what I wanted, and he stimulated my desires accordingly. Through my experiences with Michael, I learned for the first time that women could also ejaculate. This was also something Michael had taught me, referring to the phenomenon of fluid release at the moment of climax. Every time I released fluid, I felt an indescribable intense excitement, and Michael would get even more aroused each time. However, facing my husband after experiences with Michael became increasingly difficult. Time with my husband was now just boring. My husband still liked stimulating things, but his skills remained the same. I could no longer be satisfied. Nevertheless, I put more effort into my time with my husband. My efforts to please my husband stemmed from my guilt. For half a year, my husband had no suspicions, which amplified my guilt even more. As time passed, I realized that the passion with Michael couldn't make me happy forever. For most of the time, I had to live in conflict and pain. While I thoroughly enjoyed physical pleasure when I was with Michael, my relationship with my husband plunged me into deep emptiness. The time spent with Michael was a moment that made me forget reality, and everything seemed perfect. He would sometimes whisper in my ear, "You're mine. You can't escape from my hands." His words completely captivated me as if he had hypnotized me, and I had no choice but to move according to his words. Michael reigned over me like a king in the darkness, and I had no choice but to submit to him. Michael treated me as if he controlled my entire life. All of his actions had a powerful influence on me, and I felt as if I were under his control. I moved according to his commands as if my life had no meaning without Michael. As this whole situation deepened, I felt more and more strongly that I couldn't escape. In that room, I was no longer my everyday self, but had become an existence solely to fulfill Michael's desires. It made me forget who I really was. While I was with him, I gradually lost myself. It wasn't until much later that I realized what Michael had been doing to me was gaslighting. His control made me dependent on him and made me feel anxious when I wasn't with him. He dominated all my actions as if he had thoroughly tamed me. Every time I was with him, I moved according to his touch and commands. Taking off my clothes as he instructed and acting as he desired became a matter of course for me. Michael controlled me perfectly and made it impossible for me to escape from him. He manipulated my life so that I couldn't even think of breaking free from his grasp. When we were in the midst of sweating, I couldn't see anything because of the blindfold. Suddenly, I heard the door open and I tried to get up in surprise, but I unconsciously followed Michael's words when he said, "Lie down and stay still." Michael started moving again, and I could hear the sound of clothes being taken off and excited breathing from the side. That day was truly a nightmare for me. We spent time together until 10 p.m. that day. When Michael drove me home, autumn in New York had already turned chilly, and I suddenly felt very cold. The fact that he had so easily shared me with someone else was confusing. What kind of existence was I to him? Perhaps I was just one of his many playthings. He might be showing interest in me now, but that interest would inevitably fade over time. These thoughts brought tears to my eyes. I felt utterly miserable and no different from a prostitute. These were tears of regret. An infinite hatred for my husband blossomed in my heart. It was his curiosity and desire that had led me down this path. Women are always emotional creatures. When they love a man, they can do anything for him. However, Michael's attitude made me question such emotions for the first time. Without emotions, a woman would not easily give herself away. At least, I wouldn't. This whole situation plunged me into confusion, and it felt like all the emotions that had been suppressed until now were bursting out. As soon as I got home, I lay on the bed and burst into tears. Disappointment in Michael, my husband, and myself filled me with the question, was this really the life I wanted? And I fell into a deep sleep, not knowing what to do next. After that, I tried to cut ties with Michael. I occasionally received his messages for a few months, but I consciously avoided him, trying not to depend on him. I even looked for business trip opportunities to avoid him. And I started receiving psychological counseling. This sense of loss affected my real life as well. My relationship with my husband became increasingly cold, and there were days when we didn't speak a word to each other all day. As time passed, One day, on New Year's Day, I called Michael. I spoke to him resolutely. "Let's end this now." Michael was surprised but soon answered confidently. "You can't escape from me. This is your destiny." I said firmly, "Stop it. I was just one of your playthings, wasn't I? I won't do this anymore. Don't interfere with my life. If you contact me one more time, I'll report you to the police." The moment I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of liberation. After the Lunar New Year holidays, I proposed divorce to my husband. The experience with Michael made me unable to ignore the confusion and pain deep in my heart any longer, and ultimately convinced me that I couldn't maintain this marriage. My husband was very surprised and tried to hold on to me. To my husband's questions about the reason, I didn't tell the truth until the end. I thought that if I revealed the truth, he would completely lose hope in life. I calmly said, "I just want a peaceful life. I can no longer accommodate your perverted hobbies. This is not the life I want." My words contained the minimum amount of hurt I could give to my husband, and I thought this was the last consideration I could give him. My husband lowered his head in silence and could no longer hold on to me. He, too, knew that we had crossed a path of no return. As I signed the divorce papers, the times we had spent together flashed through my mind. But now it was a past that couldn't be returned to. I started making efforts to find myself. As I broke free from Michael's gaslighting, I tried to regain my identity. After ending my marriage with my husband, there was emptiness and sadness in my heart, but at the same time, there was also anticipation for a new beginning. Meeting my new husband happened more suddenly than I thought, through an introduction by a friend, and at first, I met him without any particular expectations. He was a few years older than me. His first impression was of a very trustworthy person, and he accepted and respected me as I was. His sincere interest and consideration were a great comfort to my wounded heart. The time spent with him allowed me to believe in love again and open my heart. He always gave me a warm smile whenever he was with me, and he was always there for me in difficult moments. He helped me overcome my past wounds and, above all, loved me for who I am. After marriage, we built a peaceful and stable daily life. He gave me a sense of security and happiness, and every moment spent together felt special. On weekends, we would go for walks together or try new recipes, enjoying our time. He always respected my opinions and planned the future with me. Especially when I told him the news of my pregnancy, he hugged me tightly with tears in his eyes. Now we have a new family. You and our child are so precious to me. I'll work hard to create an even happier family in the future. His sincere words made me feel grateful to him once again. After the pregnancy, he took care of me more actively, preparing warm tea for me every morning, and after work, we spent time listening to music for prenatal education. He also helped decorate the baby's room for our upcoming child, and we shared stories about the child's future, drawing our dreams together. Now, I feel that this time spent with my new husband is the most precious moment in my life, putting my past wounds behind me. In his love and care, I've been able to smile again, and I'm dreaming of a happier future with our child who will be born soon. I'm grateful for every day I spend with him, and I can now say that I'm truly happy. This ordinary but warm life is the life I truly want. That's the end of today's story. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. I'll bring you more stories. Thank you for watching.